Good afternoon, everyone. Why don't you take a seat? We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, a very warm welcome to all of you, and thanking you for joining us at this very special and meaningful event. I'm going to turn the podium over to our Dean, Dr. Brooks Jackson, to say the opening remarks, and then we will begin moving forward with our symposium today in honor of Dan Markingson. Dean Jackson.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you all for being here today for the first annual Dan Markingson Symposium. This event marks an important step forward for the Department of Psychiatry and for the university as a whole. We need to foster open dialogue, and we need to be willing to challenge ourselves to improve the way we work with patients and their families, particularly in the treatment of mental health. Obviously, the Dan Markingson story is a tragic one, but the only way we can try to prevent issues like this one is by being willing to take a clear-eyed look at what happened, how we should have handled things differently, and what we need to change to prevent these kinds of issues in the future. As an institution, we have made significant progress reforming our processes related to human research participant protections. And we've made a commitment to implement the recommendations of an external review, which identified many areas for improvement in our practices and protocols. We have been able to successfully implement all of these reforms, making significant changes aimed at protecting human participants, particularly those with diminished mental capacity. But we know our work in this area has no finish line. We have an ongoing responsibility to keep improving and pushing ourselves to be leaders in research safety, and patient protection. Dr. Vinogradov understands this challenge, and she has embraced the opportunity to help change the culture and climate of her department and of our research enterprise as a whole. And I want to especially thank Dr. Vinogradov for putting this symposium together and for her efforts to usher in a new era for her department. She has done an excellent job reaching out to those who have been critical of the department and the university, making sure we are listening to what they have to say and taking action to address their concerns. I also want to thank Mary Weiss for agreeing to this event and for letting us name this symposium in honor of her son. And I want to thank Mike Howard, who has been generous with his time and gracious in his willingness to speak with Dr. Vinogradov and with me on numerous occasions to help us determine the best path forward as we try to address clinical research issues. Our health sciences schools are committed to delivering on this important mission, and we train the next generation of health professionals. We conduct groundbreaking research, and we do provide leading-edge care. All of that needs to be done with an understanding that the needs of patients and families come first, no matter what. I'm excited about the steps we've taken to make sure we are responsibly fulfilling our mission, and I'm hopeful that events like this symposium will help us to continue to move forward together. Thank you again for coming today.
So I realized I was so excited to get things started that I actually forgot to introduce myself. My name is Sophia Vinogradov, and I'm the new department head of psychiatry. I know many of you here in this room, and you have each, in your own ways, contributed to welcoming me. Some of you know that I moved here about 7 months ago from California. This already feels like home, and it's been an amazing 7 months, an amazing journey. So. And in some ways, this is the capstone. This is really kind of something I've been looking forward to being able to implement since the day I arrived, and here we are. So I'm quite excited. I've been thinking a lot about this symposium, and the thoughts that really came into my mind over the last few days are that, and you are all aware of this, we live in a time of incredible divisiveness politically, right? Liberals versus conservatives, Republicans versus Democrats. In this geopolitical scene, Israelis versus Arabs, North Korea versus the rest of the world, the sense of science versus faith. And so it's very easy, the world is becoming so polarized, and it's very easy for us to kind of live with this sense of finger pointing, of blame, of us versus them, of I'm right, you're wrong, you're either in my camp or you're against my camp. It's sort of a culture of blame and self-righteousness, vindictiveness even, despair at times. But each of you who has decided to come here today has actually decided to take a different path. By being here, by coming to this symposium in honor of Dan Markingson, you have been willing to recognize that tragic events happened, that we must learn from them, but you're also choosing to follow a path forward, a path which is going to be one of remembrance, of respectful dialogue, of healing, and of reconciliation. I think what we are doing here today is an incredible gift to ourselves and to our community, and perhaps to our communities larger. We all know that we need more of this in the world. Now, I've never had the honor of knowing Dan Markingson, but I have read about him in these beautiful personal memoirs that his mother, Mary Weiss, wrote about him. And I'm quite certain that Dan himself would have chosen this path. This is the path he would have wanted us to follow, this path of reconciliation. And in this way, his life makes a difference to each of us here and to our community. As Mary Weiss wrote in her memoirs, this doesn't render Dan's life any less real or his death any less painful, but Dan's life will have made a difference, not just to me, but a difference to a world that missed out on a very unique, loving individual who would have left deep, indelible tracks on the hearts of many. By being here today, we are allowing just that to happen. So we're able to move forward together today, respectfully, on this path of healing and dialogue and learning, thanks to the emotional generosity, I think as Dean Jackson already mentioned, and thoughtfulness of Mary Weiss and of Mike Howard, who supported the creation of this symposium and provided me with a lot of important background information. I'm very grateful to them. I'm also grateful to Dan's other family members. Mary could not be here with us today, but she is well represented by her sister, Diane Ney, and by her cousin, Mary Prichet. I hope I'm getting those pronunciations correct or correct enough. So I would like to kind of give our thanks to Mike, to Mary, and to Mary's family who are here. Okay, so here we are. How are we going to take our first steps together in honor of Dan, in honor of his life, and in support of this new path forward? Well, to begin with, we're going to continue to grow and learn and become more informed and thoughtful in how we work with people with mental illness and with their family members, both to meet their treatment needs, which is what we do as clinicians in a department of psychiatry, but also to move forward with performing very important research that will lead to happier and healthier lives for all. That's the focus of today's lecture and today's panel discussion. But secondly, I'm very pleased to announce a new initiative that we're going to be undertaking. I will be investing to support a new archivist role in the university library system, a new young archivist who will be joining us in the summer. And the role of this person, this professional archivist, will be to archive materials related to the Dan Markingson case and other related cases and events that have occurred within our department. These are topics very important to our department's history and to our relationship with the community. And by creating a formal set of library archives for these historical events, we'll be able to continue to advance the study and dialogue surrounding a difficult period in our department and community. And we'll also be able to create an enduring resource for current scholars and future scholars so that we may really continue to learn and move forward and ensure that such events do not happen again. With that in mind, with these new steps forward, thank you, I would like to introduce our lecturer for today. It's a real personal pleasure to introduce Dr. Jerry August. Dr. August and I have already had a chance to begin working on some research projects together, and I can tell you he is, in addition to being a very successful researcher and a brilliant scientist, a very kind, thoughtful, and just warm-hearted man. There's no other way of putting it. Dr. August is a professor of family and social sciences. He's also the director of the Center for Personalized Prevention in Children's Mental Health, and he's co-director of the Institute for Translational Research in Children's Mental Health. He has a reputation which is known internationally for his work. Over the past 30 years, he's published numerous papers that have really changed how we think about treatment needs and treatment pertaining to children and adolescents with mental health issues. He has particularly focused in recent years on age-targeted preventive measures for substance use disorders in children and adolescents. His work has been recognized by numerous national kind of level, Department of Justice, Substance Abuse Prevention National Registry. The honors kind of go on and on. He really is someone who thinks about not just how do you think about new treatments and create new treatments, but how do you work with partners in the community so that these treatments are really things that the community, that families, that providers want to engage with, so that it will actually be a treatment that can get into the hands of people who need it. And today, Dr. August has been willing to sort of take on a slightly new topic for him in terms of giving a formal talk, but one that I know that he has kind of enacted day in and day out in his life as a researcher. And this is going to be on work, kind of really focusing and teaching us on the issue of families as partners in research, how investigators, communities, and families can work together to engage in research that is rigorous, participatory, and ethical. Please join me in welcoming Dr. August.
Sophia, thank you very much for that generous and flattering introduction. Oh, I'm so proud and honored to be the lead speaker today for this inaugural Dan Markingson Symposium. This is an amazing turnout. And let me say that this impressive outpouring of support is a tribute to Dr. Vinogradov, who in her brief period of leading the Department of Psychiatry has generated a groundswell of energy, enthusiasm, passion, renewed optimism among the faculty, students, trainees, and staff at the Department of Psychiatry, as well as the greater Twin Cities mental health community. This symposium is her inspiration, a time for reconciliation and healing, a time to embrace and to rebuild, a time of enlightenment, and a time to think forwardly. So I'm very enthusiastic about coming here to start to move this. We are gathered today, a number of years removed from the loss of a young man and a member of our civic community, Dan Markingson, who tragically died during a period of time in which he was a participant in a clinical research trial. We seek to understand the circumstances that may have contributed to Dan's untimely death, including the research process itself. But more importantly, we seek to bring meaning to his life and death by engaging in an open and honest discourse about how we can better serve the people we care for and the people we studied. My task, our task today, will not be to assign blame or to engage in a heated rhetoric or debate about research ethics. Instead, we choose to follow a more visionary and proactive path, a path that will explore the power of partnerships as a way to improve the quality of care we deliver and the conduct of research we perform. Now, let me say from the outset, I am not a research ethicist. I have not written or published articles on research ethics. I've never been on the IRB. I did stay at the Holiday Inn Express a couple days ago. My qualifications to speak to you today are 43 years of experience as a clinical child psychologist, educator, and research scientist in children's behavioral health. During that time, I have led or co-led close to 50 research projects, many of which involved families and community partners. The focus of my research was primarily with vulnerable children, children with autism, attention deficit disorder, conduct disorders, as well as youth with substance abuse, as well as an entire spectrum of young children who are at risk for mental health problems. As people from Farmers Insurance like to say, I know a few things because I've seen a few things. Anyway, along my professional journey, I've had many interesting, challenging, and informing experiences. So I'd like to start off with sharing several of those experiences. I call them anecdotes. I'm going to go back in time, way back in time, to my years as a graduate student, my first research study. Bear in mind that during this time, there was no IRB. There were no consent forms. I received no training in responsible conduct of research. That was just not the way it was back in the 1970s. Well, with that said, I had this research project, and I was going to study children and look at the relationship between personality traits and how they learned at school. And my advisor says, I know a principal. Go visit him. He'll allow you to do your research. So, of course, I got in my car and drove a number of miles to the school, went into the principal's office, and I started explaining what I want to do. He says, okay, I'll start lining up the kids and you can get going. That was research back in 1970s. Several years later, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. And during that period of time, I was engaged in what I thought a very important research project studying the genetics of autism. And as part of that study, I needed to interview family members. And genetic research there then was not as it is today with DNA work. It was just doing family interviews and doing pedigree analysis to see if there were any characteristics among family members that would lead you to believe there's a relationship between family members. And once again, there were no IRBs and there were no consent forms. And I got on the phone and I began contacting families who had had children who had come through the hospitals and clinics. And again, I didn't have a lot of background in what I was doing, but I guess I had some innate skills with families because I understood how important visiting these families were. And I must say, my experience with Iowa, when I got off the plane in Cedar Rapids, I thought I was in Mars. And, but I would say to you, second only to Minnesotans, Iowans were the nicest and most generous people I've ever met in my life. Second to you guys. Anyway, with that said, I traveled all over the state, meeting families and working with families and getting to know families. And I understood that if I was going to ask them to share with me very personal and private information, that I had to build a relationship. And so I did. And that remained throughout my career a very defining experience, how important it is to develop trust and respect for your families and to engage them in the research itself. You know, I would show them how interested I was in their children. And, you know, these are parents who had children with rather catastrophic behavioral disorders. And I had to be compassionate and considerate, and I was for some reason, you know. And but nevertheless, that was a very important experience for me. Several years later, I was now an assistant professor at the University of Texas, and I was director of a treatment and research center for autistic children. And shortly thereafter, there was this very provocative publication in a New England Journal of Medicine. And it had a scientific title, but the article was really titled, "We Found the Cure for Autism." And of course, as you might expect, we began getting phone calls from people throughout the greater Texas area, everybody interested in this particular study, and could we provide similar types of resources. Anyway, to make a long story short, it led to a landmark multi-center research study. George Realmuto here at Minnesota was a co-investigator, as was I, at the University of Texas. You know, I think we didn't know what we were getting into. Got a little bit over our heads. Again, you know, this was a multi-center site. It was coordinated at UCLA, and we just carried our marching orders out. But and I could talk about that study for a number of reasons. But the one I will select is the fact that, you know, these parents are desperate parents, and they come in and they believe their child may be cured by being part of this study, which is one of the problems we always struggle with when we deal with very problematic children and youth. In the article, they had only published results on a sample of about 5 or 6 kids. They had shown significant changes in intelligence and social behavior and adaptive functioning on this new drug called fenfluramine, which was a serotonin antagonist that looked like it was going to be the answer. But as most research studies go, it didn't turn out to be the answer. And people like George and I were faced with families extremely disappointed and sometimes very angry. And it instructed me on how difficult it is to wear 2 hats, one as a clinician, one as a researcher when you're doing this type of work. So again, it was another very important lesson learned. So onward, I come to the University of Minnesota, the late 1980s, and my research focus kind of changed from working with hospital and clinic patients to going out into the community. Once again, I did not have a lot of experience working in communities. But armed with some NIH grant funding and extremely excited about doing this work, I began to schedule appointments with principals in the inner Minneapolis city. And of course, I was going to be working with culturally diverse children, all whom were considered in some way, shape, or form to be at risk for mental health problems. And the lessons I was to learn over the next 10 years were very, very informative, because I would walk into these principal offices and I had no knowledge of the history of ethnic relationships and how important culture was to these people, and I didn't have the language. And so day after day, I was faced with some very, very difficult challenges. In the end, it all worked out. But what it informed me was how important it is in doing research, not only to have relationships with families, but to have relationships with communities. Because a great deal of research does involve communities. A lot of the patients and clients we work with aren't just not inpatients and outpatients, but they can be found in family resource centers. They can be found in government agencies like welfare and protection, juvenile diversion, domestic violence shelters, and family supportive housing. Over the years, our research has taken us to all those places. In each place, we're faced with people who are somewhat suspicious of what we're up to, interested in how it's going to benefit them and their patients. And a person really has to be knowledgeable about these things. And of course, when I first started, I wasn't. Anyway, these experiences were all defining moments in my career, each with its own challenges and each with its own lessons. With that as kind of a backdrop, I begin what I consider to be my topic for the day. And as you might have already surmised, it's going to be about partnerships, which I believe are the mortar behind a lot of the research that goes on in mental health. You know, although there's a lot of important wet lab research that goes on in psychiatry and mental health, much of the work that is done in communities, and specifically more with families. So, if we are to engage in mental health research that is rigorous, participatory, and responsible, a cooperative effort is necessary involving partnerships among the three primary constituencies who have a stake in the process and products of research: investigators, community stakeholders, and individuals and their families. In what follows, we're going to examine the research experience through the lens of each of these partners, with a focus on the challenges each confronts and how partnering with the other may lead to effective solutions to these challenges. We'll begin with investigators. And I'm going to be brief here because I want to spend the majority of my time on communities and families. Most of the people in the audience are fairly well schooled on some of the challenges that we all face as investigators. And clearly, with all the training we now have in responsible conduct, we understand where we need to go. But anyway, for purposes of being complete here, I will just share some thoughts. Three challenges here: recruitment, informed consent and assent, and engagement. By recruitment, I'm going to refer to the process and/or methods that we use to bring attention to and elicit interest in a research study. As we all know, for some types of studies, there is considerable pressure to recruit participants, as failure to recruit adequate numbers of participants can jeopardize the successful completion of your work or result in loss of funding. For other studies, failure to recruit can be a lost opportunity to test a potentially important cure or treat a non-responsive patient. Recruitment in mental health can be especially challenging. Can be especially challenging as patients and their families often lack understanding of mental health problems, have difficulty accepting a diagnosis, and are thus reluctant to serve as a research participant. They do not want to be further stigmatized by participation in a research study. This is one of our greatest obstacles, stigma, that comes with mental health. And it's something, again, that has to be addressed by investigators. They're also conflicted by the need for intervention, especially interventions that use powerful psychotropic medications. And finally, due to misinformation, anger, fear, or paranoia, are often mistrustful of the purpose of the research and the motives of the investigators. In response to these challenges, investigators must be cautious of unintentionally succumbing to various forms of coercion, harassment, and deception. These are very significant issues that all investigators must be responsive to. And they don't often happen intentionally. They happen by your zeal to do your research. Investigators must also use language, metaphors, and imagery in recruitment advertisements that do not create illusory expectations of the likely benefits that participants will receive. As we all know, consent and assent are very, very important issues that we have to address in our research. This is especially true with vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations not only include patients afflicted with debilitating illnesses, such as those who are mentally challenged due to diminished cognitive and emotional capacity, but it also includes children, those who are non-English speaking, those who are unable to read, those who are experiencing stress and grief, or those who are socially disenfranchised. All of those people represent vulnerable populations. The inclusion and/or exclusion of vulnerable individuals from clinical trials not only poses difficult ethical questions, but can have extremely important ramifications, especially when life-threatening illnesses are involved. We could spend hours on this topic. There's a voluminous topic, but it's really not the theme of my presentation, but I felt necessary to broach that today. By engagement, I refer to the adherence to the research protocol that takes place during a trial. Once a person has enrolled and begun to participate in a study, there are a myriad reasons that threaten engagement: perceived failure of treatment, adverse side effects, time commitments, logistical barrier, fatigue. In addressing this challenge, conflicts of interest arise when investigators wear two hats, clinician and researcher. What is in the best interest of the patient may not be in the best interest of the research study, or vice versa. So, just to mention several of the challenges we have. On to the solutions. The golden rule of research comportment, as it is in clinical comportment, is that when we recruit, enroll, and engage our participants or our patients, we must work to build trust. There's no more important word in the work that we do: trust. We must build trust with our clients, patients, research participants, our families, and our community partners. You'll hear this word reiterated several times during my lecture today. We must be transparent when explaining the goals, expectations, intended benefits, and potential risks of the research. Nothing can be concealed. Everything needs to be out front. And we must display compassion, respect, and uphold the dignity of all of our research participants. You know, sometimes researchers kind of lose perspective. And I'm not saying this is necessarily true of people doing clinical research, but anybody. You know, we're so busy, we have so many time demands that we don't take those extra minutes to really build trust and to show genuine compassion. Secondly, although initial contact to participate in a research study should be approved or conducted by the primary investigator, we should consider designate a person or a team of people other than the primary investigator to direct and oversee recruitment, enrollment, and engagement. Again, this is protection against the conflict of interest that hovers over us all the time. These individuals should be trained in the principles, standards, and regulations of responsible conduct in research and the informed consent process. They should be free of conflict as it pertains to the goals and anticipated outcomes of the research. They should be given autonomy to make decisions that are in the best interests of the participants and not necessarily in the best interest of the investigators. We need to have those people to give us that kind of support. I don't necessarily like the word protection, but support. You know, I want to have somebody doing that kind of work who represents the patient's interests and not necessarily mine. Although at times we get frustrated because we're losing potential research subjects that we need. Third bullet, the enrollment of research participants should be understood, the enrollment including informed consent and assent should be understood as a process, not merely the signing of forms. A careful process of communication is necessary, one that includes the opportunities for individuals to ask questions and investigators to make assessments of the extent to which a decision about participation is made freely and with understanding. Although failures of comprehension about any elements of research participation may raise ethical concerns, a particular concern is whether prospective research participants understand that they will be participating in research and that the purpose of research differs from the purposes of standard clinical care. During the time I was preparing for this particular lecture, I had the fortune of a son who's a pediatric oncologist who directs an experimental therapeutics program at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City. And he's continually working with families of patients, young children and adolescents who have cancer. And as you know, they have phase 1 and phase 3 trials, depending upon whether they're newly diagnosed cases or whether they're refractory cases that have been unresponsive. And I've tried to pick his brain to understand how they go about making these very important decisions and how they engage consent and assent. And there's much for us to learn. Of course, cancer is much different than mental health. I think mental health creates many more complications in that respect. But, the decision to treat as opposed to enter a research trial is a very, very delicate one. In the recruitment and enrollment of research participants, investigators are encouraged to adopt a phased approach, to allow participants sufficient time to grasp the various elements of the research process. Sorry for not keeping up with my slides here. Apologize for that. Okay, here I am. I'm back on track. Why this phase process is going to address these 3 very important questions. Why are they being invited to participate in research? What they will be asked to do as part of research, and how the research may or not benefit them. And I look at this in terms of 4 stages or phases. The first phase is education. So when we talk about recruitment and enrollment in a study, it's a process that we take a person through. I can, even in clinical areas, when I was doing a lot of clinical work, trying to help a parent understand what's going on with their child, the first time they're overwhelmed, they're confused, they can't hear a word you're saying. So to start talking about specifics and research involvement is totally inappropriate in those type of situations. You have to be respectful of where that person is. And my approach was always to try to understand what it would be like for me to be on that couch or in that seat, what I would be going through with a child who's experiencing some rather serious behavioral emotional problems. And I can only imagine what it's like when a physician has to tell a parent your child has leukemia. These are very, very taxing times, but it has to be done in a very, I think, systematic way. And the first phase here is really education. That really doesn't even speak to the research. Does this prospective research participant understand the nature of the illness, including the presenting symptoms, functional impairments, variable course, probabilities of outcomes? Does the research participant understand the various treatment options available, their efficacies, and potential adverse effects? So it's a primer in trying to help the parent, the family, come to understand what we're actually faced with here. Once you feel comfortable with that, then I think you could move on to the second phase, presenting of a research opportunity. Again, getting back to oncology trials, there are wonderful opportunities for families to receive a new targeted chemotherapy or pharmacotherapy, and this becomes almost a standard option for many patients. Does the research participant understand the difference between a standard treatment and a research-based treatment? Sometimes they may be one and the same, but that must be clarified. Does the research participant understand that he or she has a choice to refuse participation in research without prejudice or retribution? Patients' families they can be easily intimidated by their providers, and therefore feel that they may not have any choice. The third stage, explanation of research methods. Does the research participant understand what activities they'll be asked to do as part of the study? Complete questionnaires, participate in interviews, perform laboratory tests. Does the research participant understand randomization? You know, we all understand randomization, but does a ordinary person not involved in research have any idea what really that means? You know, is it a lottery or what's going on here? So a lot of time has to be taken to understand this, because you have to sometimes tell the patient or the family that there are control options in this research study. And of course, nobody wants to be assigned to that. And again, this is participation in a research study. And if you feel uncomfortable with that, you can leave. I remember being part of a research study when all families were invited to come to, I believe it was a community center. They had shown and expressed interest in participating in a research study. And they were told that there were two different treatment conditions. One was a particularly valued program, and the other one was more or less a standard of care that didn't come with a lot of excitement. And they were told, and right in front of them, that we're going to draw out of this particular container what your assignment would be. Okay? And so the draw was done. And for those people who were randomly assigned to the control condition, many of them were never seen again, which again reflects some of the challenges that researchers have to contend with all the time. In clinical trials, many times you have waiting list options where a patient can be a control for several months and then switch to active treatment. But in the type of work I do, where we're doing long-term follow-up studies and patients have to be followed for months or years, you don't have that option. So when a person gets assigned to a control condition, they don't necessarily get the type of treatment they want. And then the last phase of our approach here is a review of the rights of research participants. And this should be done, again, with a lot of time and consideration. Does the research participant understand the procedures for eligibility, protection, confidentiality, potential risks and benefits, mandated reporting of allegations of abuse and neglect, permission to withdraw from the research at any time without discrimination, and access to research staff at any time if they have questions or concerns? We're developing a partnership here, okay? That's what I'm trying to emphasize. Not an indifferent relationship between a subject and a family. I mean, an investigator. This is the seeds toward developing partnerships. And there's a rule of thumb here that we should follow. Set a high bar for informed consent and a low bar for informed dissent. When there's any questions involved, we have to withdraw that person. We err on the side of not exposing them to something when they're ambivalent, indifferent, confused, disoriented, lack competency. Okay, we could have talked for hours on investigators, but I said I wanted to spend the lion's share of my time this afternoon talking about the partnerships we need to have in communities and the partnerships we need to have with families. As I said earlier, much of mental health research is conducted in cooperation with various community systems of care. These community organizations are often viewed as practical resources for research studies. They provide access to research participants. They provide space, time, staff. However, many times we ignore other roles which they need to play. All too often, the community has been neglected as an active and contributing partner. Just as a place to carry out research, they must be a partner. A strong working relationship with a community partner can strengthen a research study, while a poor or damaged relationship can weaken a study, lead to protocol violations, and even sabotage or terminate a study. A number of challenges, once again. must be confronted when working in community settings. Again, thinking of going back to my days meeting with Minneapolis schools and principals, and in future days working with agencies and organizations that serve at-risk families. These are some of the challenges that we often face. Among community members, there often exists a high level of mistrust working with research investigators. In part, this is due to a history of exploitation, abuse of participants, failure to protect client confidentiality, and the unauthorized sharing and publication of data. We can go all the way back to Tuskegee and chronicle episode after episode of where communities have been abused by research. So it doesn't surprise you to learn that there's going to be suspicion and mistrust. Then there's the issue of hit-and-run research, where researchers receive a funded grant and then search for a community partner to supply research participants and other resources for their project. In such cases, the researchers are very amicable when they meet at front end and are very willing to cooperate. But then when the research is studied, they disappear, failing to share any of their resources and certainly maybe taking their products with them, leaving the community without anything. Doesn't happen as much today, but at one time it was a very serious issue. So what began initially with heightened expectations for the community partner and rekindled hopes is followed by bitter disappointment and hardened commitments and refusal to do research again in the future. And those people, early stage investigators who go out and try to begin their careers, are faced with this. You meet with people and they've already been abused. And it's very difficult sometimes to get started. A second challenge let me see here. I'm missing the second challenge, I believe. Oh, thank you. Absence of community identity reflected in research. Research studies typically address questions of interest to the investigators, which may not reflect questions of interest to the service organization at the community or the community at large. You have a research question that you would like to study, and you know you need the participants that are available to you there, but the research question you have really doesn't reflect the identity of the organization in which you're working with. For example, the investigator may be interested in validating a new intervention, whereas the community is interested in reducing healthcare disparities that exist in their community by improving accessibility and affordability of care. There's two different motives there. You have an intervention you'd like to test, and they're struggling with getting their people appropriate medical care and being able to finance that care. That creates serious problems. Also, the culture of the community is often at odds with the culture of research. Service organizations, whether they be schools, care systems, or agencies, struggle with the requisites of research studies. Those of you who have done community research know exactly what I'm speaking about. You have inclusion and exclusion criteria. We don't want patients that have these characteristics. We only want to have these kind of... No, that's not the way it works in a community. They serve an entire population, and you have to understand that you may have to compromise. Randomization, which we also talked about. When you raise that word with community partners, they start getting very nervous. You mean some of our clients are not going to be able to participate in this intervention and be assigned to a natural progression group or a inner control condition? Well, that's what NIMH requires us to do. That's how we get funds to do this research. How are you going to reconcile that? You need a skill set to deal with that, or you're going to walk out the door with nothing. And there are strategies and skills for how to negotiate these things, but many times researchers lack those. When your interventions differ from existing standards of care, we run into this all the time. Communities are very passionate about what they already do. And you're coming in and you're offering them something new. Now, we use the term evidence-based treatment. We expect everybody to start bowing to us because we have these evidence-based treatments. But they're very passionate about what they do. Many of these indigenous forms of intervention have long-standing utilization and success. You're coming in and you want to do something different. And you have to, again, be able to negotiate. Many of our evidence-based programs are manualized, where staff are going to be asked to follow scripts of how interventions are going to be delivered. They're not used to doing this. They like to sit with their clients and talk and share, and now they've got to do these kind of didactic interventions. And then there's also staff burden in terms of training time and supervision time. And then there's the issue of cost reimbursements. Who's paying? All right? In the old days, our research grants used to pay for the services that we would provide. In more recent times, grants will pay for research, but they don't often pay for service delivery. So how are we going to do research in the community if we don't have these funds? And you have to be creative and find new ways to make that happen. These are all challenges that go into developing community partnerships. All right, let's turn to some solutions. The prerequisite of a successful investigator-community partnership is collaboration. Okay, you've heard that word over and over and over again, and sometimes it loses its meaning because it's lost. It's a process by which two or more people or organizations work together to realize or achieve a successful outcome. In order for us to create genuine and sustainable collaborations, an ongoing and meaningful partnership must be established from beginning to end. And it must involve joint ownership of the research project. Researchers don't like to give up control. Well, if you're going to be successful, you have to give up control, or you're not going to get your work done. It has to be a compromise. So we're promoting joint ownership and another concept that you're going to hear for the rest of the day, shared decision making. You want cooperation, you're going to have to agree to share in the decision making. You often hear the word buy-in. In order to achieve buy-in in your research, you're going to need to provide ownership opportunities of your research, and we'll talk about what that really means. Here are five, and I don't know that you can see this that well, and I apologize. I'll try to articulate what's being displayed here. But on this particular figure, we have outlined what we call foundational principles of successful collaboration. Each of these principles can be assessed along a continuum, as you see here, with the far right-hand side being defined as the most intensive level of collaboration, while the left side mirrors low levels of collaboration between researchers and mental health stakeholders. And I'll try to go through this quickly. Does somebody have a time for me, please? What? Quarter of? What? Yeah, you know. Okay. We're at the, we're not at the end, but we're getting there. And of course, nothing will be changed. Everything goes on. We may be here at 8 o'clock. No, we'll be done. Number one, negotiation and adoption of shared goals. Priorities may be similar when you first engage in a collaboration, but they may diverge over time. For example, both researchers and community partners would agree that a new evidence-based psychotherapy may provide stronger and more sustained benefits for their clients than the existing standard of care. However, the researcher's primary focus may be simply to replicate the program with high standards of fidelity, while the community provider may be more interested in adapting the program to be compatible with their own service orientation. So you have these kind of divides that take place. Members of this partnership must wrestle with these divergent perspectives in order to negotiate goals that meet each other's needs. Of course, in a true collaboration, compromise would be realized. Okay, number two, equitable distribution of power. I've already alluded to this. This is where partners have equal say in decision-making and opportunities to change aspects of the research process. Many experts have voiced concern that unless power is shared, rather than being largely held in the hands of the investigator, the collaboration is nothing but a facade. Researchers and stakeholders can exercise their power in unique ways. Of course, researchers possess proposal writing skills, access to funding, and knowledge of experimental methods. But community members have knowledge of community norms and local culture and provide access to research participants' space and staff. In negotiations related to power, it is important for each partner to articulate at the beginning of the collaboration where compromise is possible from their perspective, and also identify areas that are non-negotiable. We have certainly, in my group, run into community partners who said randomization is non-negotiable. Can't do it. Okay? That's noted up front. We may talk a little bit to try to inform them and persuade them, but of course you respect their point of view. There must be a move toward the right. I'm sorry here. Where power is equally distributed. Mutual respect for the skills and competencies of each collaborative partner. For the sake of time, that's to me very self-obvious. I'm going to move forward. 4, ongoing opportunities for open communication based on commitment to honest exchanges and willingness to raise concerns without blame. I'm going to list a number of skills here that are almost imperative that researchers who work in community settings possess. As I read them, you can think about yourself and where you fall. Listening, use of language that's understandable and respectful. Negotiation, conflict resolution, consensus building, understanding and competency to operate in multicultural contexts, ability to be self-reflective and admit mistakes, capacity to operate with different power structures, and humility. Don't even walk through the door unless you possess those characteristics. And finally, once again, we see trust. There's often concern regarding the researcher's motivation. Why are you doing this research? And whether the researchers are committed to community once the funding is expended. Researchers need to be prepared to achieve credibility with their partners, and therefore must engage in tasks such as attending community events. Show that you're interested in the community. Providing in-service education and training for community staff. Distributing newsletters, offering webinars, must demonstrate your commitment. Okay? We're going to jump ahead to challenges confronted with families. The last but most important member of the research triangle of partnerships here, the families that we work with. Let's look at some of the challenges that families, that researchers confront when working with families in healthcare settings. Similar to communities, families often start from a point of mistrust and skepticism about participation in research. Individuals' approach for participation may be knowledgeable about previously highly publicized cases of research exploitation and misconduct, as well as incidents where participants have been exposed to danger in the form of potentially harmful drugs and procedures. We live in a very informative world with social media, internet. Everybody knows everything. And as we go out into the research world, we have to, of course, understand that people are going to have access to such data. There may also be fear of population profiling, racial discrimination, breach of security, invasion of privacy, such as government access of information. Especially when you're dealing with genetic data. People are very skeptical about offering DNA samples for fear somehow it's going to come back to them or their insurance carriers, etc. Number 2, families often discern a power differential in relationships with investigators. When because of age, gender, socioeconomic status, cultural affiliation, religion, youth and families perceive they are in a subordinate or marginalized role as a potential research participant, they may feel disempowered and reluctant to question the researcher, or decision-making process. Families may not understand their rights as research participants. We said this earlier in the lecture. I'll repeat again because it's so important, including a choice to refuse participation or withdraw from the study at any time. Families may not clearly understand the difference between receiving a standard treatment with a known efficacy and being participant in a research study and receiving an experimental treatment with unknown efficacy. Families are fearful that if they refuse participation, there will be consequences in terms of the quality of care they may receive. All of these are very significant challenges. Solutions. In recent years, there has been a movement in healthcare delivery toward personalized or patient-centered care. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. We're very much invested in this at the university, where the biological profiles, as well as the backgrounds, beliefs, values, traditions, and needs and preferences of healthcare clients are factored into clinical decision-making. The sine qua non of patient-centered care is shared or integrated decision-making. This has been a movement that we've seen coming over the last decade. Historically, patients have been treated as passive recipients in decisions about their health care, inadvertently distanced from the administrators who authorize their health care, the payers who finance their health care, and the providers who deliver their health care. The net result is a healthcare environment in which clients and their families are often excluded from important decisions and left in the dark about how their problems are being managed, as well as how to understand and navigate their way through the overwhelming labyrinth of diagnostic information and treatment options available to them. You know, sometimes as a client or a patient myself, I feel the same way. You know, you go into your healthcare setting and you're just overwhelmed with all this test data and information and, you know, how's this going to happen and how is it going to be financed? In 1988, the Picker Institute coined the term patient-centered care to call attention to the need for practitioners and healthcare systems to shift their focus from the disease to the family. The Picker Institute, in partnership with patients and families, identified a number of characteristics of the patient-centered care model and the most indicators of quality and safety constructed from the perspective of the patients themselves. Follow the bullets. Number one, meeting families where they are at the present point in time. Meet your families where they are in their own lives at this point in time. Their beliefs, their values, their expectations, their attributions, their preferences, their motivational cognitions are all critical to their acceptance and engagement in both care and research. Investment. In learning about each family's journey, every family has a unique history that brings them to this point in their lives. The history needs to be factored into decisions about the delivery of their care as well as the suitability for participation in research. Is this some information that you are working with when you talk to your potential research participants? Recognition of cultural and ethnic differences and health literacy in framing questions relevant to a patient's health care. You may not be familiar with the concept of health literacy. It's the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, and understand basic healthcare information and services needed to make appropriate healthcare decisions. We're working more and more in a diverse society with people from various cultural persuasions. Our research involves Somali Americans, Hispanic Americans, African Americans, you go right down the list, Asian Americans. They all come from different backgrounds, and their health literacy is going to vary, and they must be educated. Provision of emotional support and alleviation of fear and anxiety. Involvement of family members and friends about their own decisions of healthcare. In shared decision-making, both parties share information. The practitioner offers options and describes risks and benefits, and the patient expresses his or her preferences and values and concerns. Each participant is thus armed with a better understanding of the relevant factors and shares responsibilities in the decision about how to proceed. Through shared decision-making, practitioners enlist their families, not only in making decisions, but in carrying out their treatment plans. We're partners in this. There is evidence to show that when patients participate in healthcare decision-making, their compliance and adherence increases, their motivation to make treatments work rises, and their outcomes improved. How might shared decision-making translate into research settings? The same principles that guide parent family-centered healthcare can be applied to investigator-family research partnerships. This begins by giving clients and families an active voice in the research process and arming them with information to make informed decisions. And there are various ways in which we do this in our own research. Of course, we're all aware of the important role that focus groups can have. Research studies benefit when the initial focus is to assemble focus groups. These are the consumers themselves participating in an open forum to share their own information to help guide the research investigator in making various decisions. You know, an important research skill that we now teach all our trainees are called qualitative research methods. These precede more formal experimental methods, but help in terms of understanding the population that we're dealing with. Decision aids. What is a decision aid? Well, it's important that for people to participate as shared decision makers, they must understand information in a plain, non-technical language. This often can be facilitated through pamphlets, videos, other communication medium that assists clients to make effective decisions for choosing a specific treatment or participating in a research study. A decision aid might simply lay out various treatment options and inform which type of patients tend to prefer which options, or might make patients or take patients through an algorithm which assesses various beliefs and options and makes automated recommendations based upon data provided by their patient. We're looking for helping patients make informed decisions, not just arbitrary and random decisions. And finally here, cultural contextualization. Investigators should recognize ethnicity, culture, possibly religious affiliation and gender orientation as individual difference characteristics that should be factored into recruiting, enrolling, and engaging research participants, as should providers when they're delivering clinical care. Indeed, wide cultural differences exist, for example, in engagement and response to standard interventions. So, again, getting the family involved in a very active way to make informed decisions about their research participation in their clinical care. I will close with just several concluding remarks. Number one, without a commitment to scientific advancement and the pursuit of innovation, we cannot move forward as a society. There's a lot of anti-science now marching around. This has to be confronted. Consider where we would be today without discoveries in medicine. The polio vaccine, penicillin, insulin, anesthesia, heart-lung bypass, organ transplant, radiologic imaging, the Human Genome Project, just to name a few. Consider where we would be in the mental health field without SSRIs, second-generation antipsychotics, psychostimulants, behavioral modification, cognitive retraining, fMRI, integrated systems of care. Research is the wellspring of scientific discovery. As we consider new policies and regulations and research ethics, let us be careful that we do not raise the bar so high that we demoralize, discourage, and overwhelm or make it impossible for investigators to conduct research. Where will the next discoveries come? Academic researchers frequently are asked to assume administrative responsibilities, teach, train, mentor students, perform clinical and community service, while completing endless hours of documentation. This leaves precious little time to compete for funding, develop and oversee research studies, and publish and disseminate research. This is further challenged by the exponential rise in the number of researchers applying for dwindling amounts of federal funding. So in addition to the very important task of developing new safeguards and policies and training to protect research participants, we also need to explore new academic models to free up time and resources to support investigators to allow them to conduct their research. Increasingly, national institutes, private organizations, and elite academic institutions are adopting the team science model as a replacement for the increasingly unfashionable independent research model. Team science supports investigative collaboration across disciplinary boundaries, using a shared conceptual framework that integrates and transcends disciplinary perspectives. In other words, it's a movement away from siloed academic research. Team science brings together professionals with diverse but complementary backgrounds because that's what cutting research demands. If you're going to be part of the big game, you've got to move to team science. One benefit of team science is that it allows the investigator to go after grand challenges that we face in healthcare today. Second, it creates a division of labor of research so that various members can focus specifically on pieces to which they have competence and investment. And last, team science creates multiple opportunities to reinforce research integrity and oversight, and therefore responsible conduct of research. My last point. The academic motto of the University of Minnesota is driven to discovery. The road on which we drive to discovery is fast and frenetic. Problems are inevitable. The investigators in this audience, and I know many of you, early, middle, and late stage, are dedicated scientists who give much of their professional lives to searching for answers to vexing and formidable questions. The work is time-consuming, labor-intensive, and undertaken without guarantees of any success. Nevertheless, we persevere because this is our life's work, to improve the health and wellspring of our clients and patients. While it is not often publicized or heralded, what is not often publicized and heralded is the pioneering and transformational science that is going on at the University of Minnesota, nor the groundbreaking advances in clinical care. I will close here with a statement taken verbatim from a recent summary statement of a grant proposal of mine that was written by an NIMH reviewer. For those of you who don't know, summary statements are the evaluations researchers receive about whether their proposals have merit for federal funding. One criterion is the research environment in which the principal investigator works. The statement reads as follows: the University of Minnesota is a world-class institution. There can be no doubt about the superior research quality at the University of Minnesota and the impressive visionary, multidisciplinary, field-changing scientific collaborations and breakthroughs this prestigious university has consistently produced over the decades. Thank you.
Thank you. That was both incredibly inspiring and also you told it like it is. We have time for several questions before we'll move to our panel discussion with family members. So are there any questions from the audience for Dr. August?
I had a couple planted somewhere. George, you got to have a question.
This question here.
Yes, please.
I'm intrigued by your history working with autism, which has been extremely complicated, obviously, in terms of how that disorder has been defined over the years, some of the new genetic things, tremendous variation. So I guess my question is just what are your chief learnings from working with that very complicated disorder?
Yes. When George Realmuto and myself began our careers as young investigators, autism was defined by Leo Kanner as a much more circumscribed and complex disorder than it is today. The prevalence rate was like 25 out of 10,000. It was more or less the Rain Man prototype. Very bizarre behaviors, disrupted social communications, self-stimulations. Over the years, we have seen the diagnosis diluted. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what happens when the prevalence increases, there are more services available for everybody. So to some extent, we can say it's come out of the closet.
Please step to the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Step straight into this.
Yeah, I'm very sorry for that. So the diagnosis has changed. It becomes much more inclusive and includes a spectrum of problems which varies from what we knew as Canarian autism to today, which is just some kind of pervasive developmental disability, which in some respects I think challenges research because the phenotype is so grossly defined, it's hard really to work on. There have been many behavioral interventions over the years that have been used. They've been very effective, not necessarily in curing autism or turning autistic people, so to speak, into independent function individuals, but it's giving them an opportunity to do things in their life that they were never able to do before. There's much of the contemporary research is in the genetics of autism. I must say that I was one of the first people back in 1981 to publish a study that did show, using family studies and adoption studies, that autism did have a genetic basis to it, at least when we're talking about the pure form of it. Today, of course, with new DNA analysis, they're beginning really to zero down and finding aspects of autism that reflect this kind of genetic background. Was that of any help to you?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Other questions, please? I couldn't have been that clear and
I'm over
convincing.
here. Yeah, hi.
Please.
So I'm hearing from you that relationships are really, really important. I'm a child psychiatry fellow and in my training, and just wonder if you have any comment on, I think as psychiatrists, we're seen as the prescribers and sometimes not, and it takes a long time to sometimes develop relationships. And the systems aren't always set up to help foster those relationships, and I just wondered if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, our health systems continue to be a struggle for many of us. It's very frustrating at times to meet the demands that are imposed upon us. And I know my own family doctor, I asked him why he was retiring, and he said, I'm not practicing the way I was trained to practice. I want to have relationships with my clients. I don't want to have to scoot them out of my office in 15 minutes to see another patient. So there are a lot of challenges there in the delivery system that we have to deal with. And so I share with you your concerns about that. All I can say is we're aware that this is an issue, and more importantly, we're aware of how powerful partnerships and relationships are. And especially for mental health people, because mental health has a long tradition of relationships with clients as opposed to some other subspecialties. So all I can say is whatever opportunity you have, try to build those bridges. Other questions? Okay, Sophia.
I think you were incredibly clear. Thank you very much, Jerry. Let's give Jerry another sign of our appreciation. An incredible tour de force. Yeah, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think it can only really be described as a tour de force and for all of us who are able to kind of hear really all of the challenges that are pulled together in one place for investigators and for family members in the community who work with us. But I really appreciated your comment at the end, Jerry, that there is outstanding science going on here, and this is science which is going to drive the field forward and lead to incredible new developments in the field of mental health. And so it is important that we all work together. So I'd like to invite our panelists to come up now. You've got your little cards with your name so people can identify who you are. So please come up and have a seat and bring your name cards with you. What I wanted to do for the second part of the symposium is to, we heard sort of the academic vision, or I should say, set of challenges and solutions, and now I would like to turn to the more personal point of view. We have the great fortune of having some people who've been willing to participate in this symposium who have various forms of personal experience with the mental health system of care, with loved ones having mental health issues, with aspects of being involved in the university. And what I think I will do is first just ask each panelist just to briefly introduce who they are and just like one sentence about their background. And then I have some questions prepared that I'm going to ask the panelists to address. And then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So if you don't mind.
Now,
Yeah.
by background, do you mean our personal background or the background of our family member?
I'll leave it up to you, to whatever you think is sort of most relevant to what you will want to talk
Well,
about
that
here
would be
today.
my family member, I think.
Yeah.
My name is Michelle Gran. My son, Nick, was diagnosed 5 years ago with schizoaffective disorder and is currently being treated at the First Episode Psychosis Program here on campus.
My name is Beatrice Officer. I am a consumer of the mental health system. I also have a 22-year-old daughter who has a diagnosis of bipolar, and I also have a son who is 17 who has a diagnosis of pervasive developmental disorder.
My name is Mike Howard, and I'm a close friend of Mary Weiss, who was the mother of Dan Markingson, and kind of been involved with this for over 14 years, so I guess that's my experience.
My name is Kathy Allen. I have a son who's 28 and has a diagnosis of schizophrenia and autism, and he's been involved at the University of Minnesota with his care here since 2006, and we've been active in the First Episode program and a previous family-oriented program.
Good afternoon. My name is Grace Gorange, and I am the mother of a 36-year-old young man, well, not so young anymore, diagnosed with schizophrenia 10 years ago. So he was later than most young men diagnosed at a later age, and he had completed college. I would characterize, I don't even like to use the word schizophrenia anymore because of the continuum of signs and symptoms and behaviors, but I would say he's in the recovery right now. I never thought it was possible, but that's where we're at as a family.
I'm Mindy Greiling, and I have a 39-year-old son with schizoaffective disorder, and I was lucky when he was diagnosed to be serving in the Minnesota House of Representatives, so I had a perfect forum for advocacy, and I worked with Mary Weiss on her legislation when she came to the legislature, so that was a good thing to do too. I'm glad for this forum.
Great. Well, thank you all for your willingness to participate. My first set of questions for you is how can we heard from Jerry about sort of the kind of the investigator side. Now I'd like to hear from the family side and the consumer side. How can family members best play a key role in supporting mental health treatment and mental health research at the university? And what are some of the challenges that family members face in this process? And we can go in order, or whoever has an idea at the top of their mind can just jump right in.
Right. Well, I'm sure it's no news to anybody here, but I think that the HIPAA laws have really set us back. Families want to be involved usually, and that the implementation of that legislation has just been horrendous. I think there's a lot of providers who use that as a way to not have to spend too much time with people like us. And then there's others who are frustrated by it as well. But I know my son is, because he's the age that he is, he's on medical assistance, and it's quite clear that the benefit set does not include family involvement like it does with children's mental health. And that whole dynamic of money, time, and then we can't talk to you because your son didn't sign a release. You know, I just want to say our son actually always signs a release, unless he's really, really paranoid, in which case he has delusions about his family. But when he gets a little better, he signs the releases. But we, a family where our son does sign the releases, still suffer from that mentality. Everyone assumes they can't talk to us because they assume he hasn't signed a release, even when he has or hasn't been offered one.
Has that been the experience of others? Yeah.
I think for me, one of the things that I had to do, and I learned this with my daughter who had other diagnoses, depression, anxiety, and I ended up having to get guardianship. So because she has some cognitive, both of my children have cognitive limitations, and understanding the language, like Dr. August said, I think is very detrimental to their care and their recovery and their treatment. And so, and I recently just got my son's, he's gonna be 18 next month, so I already have his guardianship. Because even though you sign a release of information, they feel like they're still limited in what they can share. I'm in the office with them because of that, the guardianship. I need to be a part of their care team.
Yeah, yeah. Mike?
Well, excuse me. Speaking just from the Markingson case with experience over all these years, I guess I've come to the conclusion that no family is an island. And at times, I think that's what happened previously here. And if people are looking to engage in research, and if you want the family's engagement, I think the number one thing that maybe wasn't mentioned is educate yourself. Learn about that illness, learn about the side effects, what the symptoms are, and surround yourself with incredible help. And I'm going to take just a few minutes. It hasn't been mentioned yet, but Mary Weiss wanted to thank Sophia for this. And both Mary Weiss and myself wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for Professors Carl Elliott and Lee Turner from the university here, Nikki Jerry, a psychiatric nurse, and Governor Arnie Carlson. Without their help and support, this would never have happened. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Mike. Yeah. Any other comments from family members? And so again, I'm really interested in how, obviously, maybe this is self-evident, how you can play the key role in supporting treatment and research, but also the challenges that you're facing. We've heard about sort of the HIPAA and the release of information. Others challenges?
Well, the only thing I can say about that is I always think of myself as my son's champion and coach. And we always talk about advocacy for our kids, but I think it's really important that we keep our own, I don't want to say egos, our own perceptions of ourselves in check when we go and talk with clinicians, because I think Mindy pointed this out. There's this tendency for us to be classified maybe a little bit as interfering in the treatment. And if this is truly to be a partnership, I think it's incumbent on us too to be assertive, and maybe some of us aren't used to being that. It's absolutely necessary to start that conversation sometimes with the clinicians that might, under circumstances, not be inclined to or feel comfortable starting that.
Yep.
I wanted to mention that one thing that's important to us is that my son has always wanted me in the appointments with him. And so it was really important because, especially for the first 5 years, he would never remember what his episodes were. When he would have an episode, he wouldn't remember anything. So there was no way for him to provide anything to the doctor. And so I was allowed to be there, and that was very important to be able to give those details for him to get the proper treatment and the proper diagnosis. And one thing that has been effective in that over, for these 11 years of going to his appointments is that I don't say anything. I let him speak for the first, as long as the doctor would like, and then when I can give my input when it's asked for, so that I'm not like taking over on the whole thing. But that's, so the doctors have allowed me to be in there, and I really appreciate that.
It sounds like he's been, actually, your son has very much appreciated you playing that role. So this maybe leads me to a next question I have, which is, how can we best handle situations, and by we, I'm thinking again about treatment providers or people who might be wanting to approach a person about potential research opportunities. How can we best handle such situations when the person in question does not want their family involved in decision-making, even though the family might have important information to share or to provide? And I know this is a complex question because it's got sort of the socio-legal implications, but I know these are issues you've all thought about, so I'd love to hear your opinions.
Well, families, I think sophisticated families, which you have to be assertive, like Michelle said, quickly know that even though the providers can't share information if your family member hasn't filled out the release of information, still you can give information. And I think providers and potential research recruiters need to use that more and be upfront with that. It's hard for me to think that our son would ever want to be in research if I didn't encourage him or his father, or even give him rides to get there or whatever. So if I think people aren't going to talk to me, I'm going to discourage him from being in research. You know, parents have a lot of power with vulnerable people when they're young. So I think it's just really important to say to families, you know, your so-and-so didn't sign a release, but here's how you could give input. And I know that some families can be very time-consuming, so I always tell providers, if I get a chance, to help families know how much time there is and how they can concisely give that input. You know, if there's a way to email so that they aren't taking up all kinds of time, or they know they have 2 minutes or whatever there is, rather than let them think they have a lot of time and cut them off. That's deadly.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, I haven't had the experience of involvement with research, but as I was listening to Dr. August talk, it struck me that as they're building trust and say there is consent, but given the characteristics of somebody with mental illness, the mistrust is already there. The skepticism is already there. It may be a part of their whole, how their disease manifests itself. Paranoia is there. And so whatever it takes to build that relationship and build trust is going to be incredibly important to have any modicum of success, because they're already in a place, most likely, that they're not going to be trusting and willing to build that relationship. Personally, in our situation, like Mindy, our son, you know, he always signed a consent, so we never bumped up against that. Not willing to, they wouldn't give us information, but it was more like asking for input. I have sat through appointments and visits and so forth where we were completely ignored, and the attention was on our son, and rightfully so. But again, as been said, oftentimes our son would like to pretend that everything was fine, and there were no symptoms, and he just wanted to be normal and not sick. And, you know, we're sitting here trying, you know, just sitting on the edge of our seats, wanting them to really understand what was going on, the provider to understand. And so I think that building those relationships is opening up to the insights of family members. And I don't know how you find the time, the earlier question about appointment times and so forth. But I'll tell you what I did. I wrote like a 2-page summary of him, and especially with new providers, and I either emailed it or left it with them, because it was so important that I wanted them to know who he was beyond the diagnosis. Like, you know, people get put in boxes with mental illness very quickly, and I wanted them to know what his life had been like, what kind of person he was, and what we hoped to get back to. And that was my fallback, because, you know, I didn't know that I would always be asked to participate or be heard.
I'm so glad to hear that you did that, because I did that too, and that was partially in response to having experience with non-responsive providers in the past, and I felt it was so frustrating for me. By the time I got to the first episode program, where people were very responsive, I'm so pleased to say. But I just thought that was absolutely necessary. And then as I was handing this out and I was going through it in a very organized way, I thought, oh man, now he's going to think I'm the problem. You know, this kid's, you know, nuts because his mother is obviously unhinged. But I think you have to, really, I think you have to take that risk. Mm-hmm. And please read the emails. Please take this very seriously, because for some of us it's really difficult to put our lives out on paper like that, and because you don't know, or even in an email, you don't know where that's going to end up. Mm-hmm. And that's a gift, I think, to you. I'd like to think it's a gift to those of you who practice medicine, that if you've got that involvement from a family member, cherish that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I? I think too is essential, especially if they're saying I don't want my family member involved, or knowing that I'm a part of this study, that they kind of push the issue. Who is your support system? Who can you rely on? Is there somebody that you can trust that can support you through this? Because we as a family go through the recovery, the illnesses, the crises, just like they do. And so we have to be a part of that entire process from start to finish. So really pushing that issue and asking those probing questions. Who can we get to support you through this? Because there's going to be some difficult times. And just really taking that extra few minutes to do that is essential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other thoughts, Mike?
I was going to say, again, I'm just going to reference the Markingson case, but I've come to understand and learn that, it's a balancing act between trying to give that information and stay on good terms with the patient who obviously may be in denial, or the term I think used over and over again was a lack of insight, which basically meant that he didn't understand he had a mental illness, but yet you didn't want to run the risk, or his mother didn't, of losing his respect or his love, or feeling that she was taking control of his life. And I think it's very critical that the physician sit down with the family and the patient, and they set some boundaries. They talk about this. And the patient has to feel that they still are in control of their own lives, because I don't think they'll be engaged in treatment if they don't feel that way. Mm-hmm. To me, that is critical. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that is always continued here, or at least will start now. So
yeah, I think that's very well put. I saw other people on the panel nodding. Other thoughts or comments, or share similar experiences? Yeah.
I think that's true, and I will just add, though, Dr. August talked about the patient-centered care, and I will say from my perspective as a family member, sometimes that can be taken to such an extreme, maybe not by the psychiatrist, but out in the field with the intensive residential treatment services places or the ACT teams, where that pushes the family away. It's the patient. We're here for the person with the mental illness, and we're all to help them whatever they want. And if that is taken to an extreme, it can get to the point where family involvement is not as welcome, especially, as Mike said, if it's differing from what the person with the mental illness has to say, especially when they're delusional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Also, there are times in our experience where our son wasn't able to sign a consent form saying that we could give our input, and when he developed catatonia and really had a severe breakdown in the hospital, he really didn't even know what his own name was, so he couldn't sign anything. And one thing that we had done beforehand was had done a healthcare directive ahead of time, and when he was in a good state of mind, and we just told him that everybody in our family is doing a healthcare directive, and we all signed it together, and that turned out to be very helpful, because when he was in the hospital, we were able to give input and get input, even though he wasn't able to sign.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us about the importance of healthcare directives. Very, very critical, particularly when there's a serious episodic illness, right, where people will move into episodes where they lose insight, but then we'll have times when they're well. Any other?
No,
okay.
I just really agree.
Yeah, good. Well, we heard one of the things that maybe providers have not done so well in certain instances. For example, the family members in the room, and it's kind of like it's being ignored, even though they have permission to be in the room and so forth. Other common mistakes that treatment providers and researchers make that any of you have had experience with when interacting with family members, and likewise, given perhaps some of those observations, what suggestions would you have to us in terms of training the next generation of treatment providers and researchers?
I'll go. I mentioned or hinted at this earlier, but I really believe if we follow the science and the progress in the field of mental illness, that whole ability to look at the whole person and not just a label or a diagnosis, because the continuum of symptoms is like the continuum of everything else, from one end to the other and all the way across. And I think that my expectation of providers in whatever setting is that they look at the person beyond what the word is on the page, and understand that it's just a very complex illness or illnesses with multiple factors at work, And to think about the person in that light, and a whole person, and not just whatever the word or 2 words is on the page. And so that means attention to who they were and who they yet want to become, and their nutrition, and their fitness, and everything else that's a part of being whole.
Yeah.
And I would say optimism is hugely important, to treat the person and their family as if they've died or something's really terrible here isn't terribly helpful. I would rather have them talk about, going back to school, back to work. What are your goals? What are you planning to do as soon as you get this illness maintained? And, so often it's all about the medicine or, where you're going to live for the next 3 months at some 90-day program, or nobody can find anything for you, and it's all about short-term and illness, and we don't, I don't think it's probably in the reimbursement matrix either, along with time for families, but it really is hindering when there isn't any hope.
There were 2 points that Dr. August made that I was kind of anticipating that maybe we were going to be asked to kind of summarize what our thoughts from this. And the 2 things that I wrote down was, don't overlook the opportunities that you have for connection with the families. You should never doubt that the opportunity that you take to really listen and to respond particularly to family members' concerns and fears and issues is time that is not incredibly valuable. And the second was, look for opportunities to understand the language that the family is using. And I don't really mean necessarily a language other than English, although of course that's important too, but I can't remember who pointed out, but every family, I think it was Mike, every family is different. We're unique in that we're sharing this illness, this condition, but we're all very unique in the way that we come to this problem. And I know that for expediency, particularly if you've only got 10, 15 minutes to meet with a patient, that the urge is to kind of move it along, and listening can truly be the best move you can make in those circumstances. And if it's okay, I'd like to share and my own anecdote. There was a time when my son, in 9 months, went through 13 hospitalizations or emergency room visits, and it was impossible to navigate because I had never before been through anything like that. And of course, I was shaken. My husband was working in another state. My other adult sons were living in a different state. I felt very much alone with this very sick kid. And as a parent, you want to do anything. And we found our way to the first episode program. He was in the hospital at that time. I met with the doctor who was going to be taking care of him, and he was a young resident at the time, Dr. Michael O'Sullivan. Yeah. Oh, he is a hero. And I remember that moment. You can hear it in my voice. I remember that moment sitting in that office, and he was sitting across from me, and I was pouring out all my fears and the trauma and the concerns, and I was saying, he's such a smart kid, he's such a good kid, why is this happening, and what are we going to do? And he let me talk, and then he said, your son can get better. Mm-hmm. I couldn't imagine how that was going to be possible. And my first inclination was to say, don't you lie to me. Because I wanted so badly to have hope. Yeah. And I couldn't see anything hopeful at all in that circumstance. And at that moment, it felt like a warm blanket had been put around my shoulders. And I could feel myself relaxing, and I wasn't shivering anymore. And it was so profound. And I trusted him because he was looking at me and he with the most compassionate eyes, and he was so concerned and he was so earnest, and it was like a lifeline. The only thing that I can approximate that to for clinicians, for those of you who are physicians and want to be physicians, is just imagine what it's like to be walking on a frozen lake. You know where I'm going with this. You're walking on a frozen lake and it's a beautiful day and everything is going well, your life is good, and without warning, you feel yourself falling, the ice breaks underneath you and you feel yourself falling into this icy cold water and you're up to your waist. And you're in shock and you're thinking, how did this happen? What did I do? Where did this come from? I was being so safe, I was being so good. And you look at the shore and you can see that it's, you can get there and it's only a few feet away. And as you're trying to sort this out, somebody comes, a neighbor, somebody on the street, whatever, comes and takes off her jacket and puts it around you. And you can feel that warmth from her own body heat. And she helps you to the shore, and then you know you're not going to die. Somebody has come to help you. You know that you're not going to die. And you are that warm blanket. You need to be that warm blanket because we can navigate this once we have that reassurance, once we have that. We can refocus, we can figure out what has to happen next, and you're going to need to be with us on that journey, but you got to be the warm blanket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes, please.
One of the things that I want to say, being an African American, stigma is, for lack of better words, rampant in our community. There's a lot of denial. And being a practitioner, I think, is essential for you, it's imperative for you to acknowledge that the person, the family member that's sitting before you is facing that. And they may be on a lone island, and that was me with my children. Their father still in denial that there are some difficulties, that his children have mental illness. And so acknowledging that and asking that care provider, that caregiver, that family member, how are you doing? Who are your supports? Are you getting the help that you need? I think is important too. But also acknowledging that stigma and not taking for granted that I may not be educated about what that illness is, but speak to me, give me an opportunity to learn what my family member will face, because then I'm able to better prepare myself and be able to be a better support for my children.
Yeah. Mike, and then.
Just my thoughts on this topic here when it came up, and I wrote this down. Individuals with mental illness still have an identity. Mm-hmm. And they still have a voice. And, potential clinicians and psychiatrists, I would encourage you to basically have some open and honest conversations with these patients, ask how they're feeling, what they're struggling with, and what they would actually like from you. Maybe not just always telling them what they need, but ask and receive. It should be, as the other gentleman brought out, it's communication. And I think so many times that's missing. And communication is a two-way street. If you work together to set realistic expectations, plan the steps for those expectations, and then as a treating physician, recognize and praise that patient for their strengths and their progress on those expectations. And I think that would go a long way toward engaging that patient to accept the treatment, and I think we'd have some better outcomes.
Mike, I have a position for you in our clinic. I'm only half kidding. Please.
I wanted to add, what Michelle was describing. Also, we have had that experience by being involved in the first episode program and being involved, Michelle actually started a caregiver support group. And, like you were mentioning too, that we, as parents, we need to take care of ourselves to be able to help our own children. And I think it's important for the clinic, the psychiatrists, the doctors, to really, encourage and know about those resources and encourage people to be involved, to get involved with that kind of a group, because that's the only way that, we have survived this. And there's several people in the audience that we're together, so when something's going on with our child, we text each other, we call each other, we get together, we support each other, and that's how we can move forward, and we get ideas from each other as well. And I think something that happened recently with my son is still, seeing the psychiatrist at the U of M, and he sees residents, so that switches every year. But, I should, being involved, I should have known, I should know what to do, because I'm around people who can tell me, what resources are available. But last year, one resident said, do you need to speak to a social worker? It was a very simple question, but somehow I hadn't been able to take certain steps to get, services for my son that he really needed. And that one connection with the social worker just really changed everything, so that I was able to take that step. And he's, because I just was sort of carrying everything myself. And now that I have, an arms worker and other people in the environment, so it's not just me. That's been like a tremendous, something lifted off of myself, and it's been very good for my son to be able to set goals with somebody who is, not a family member. So I feel like the doctor, that doctor who said that, that resident, just kind of, that was really so great.
Yeah. One theme that came up in Dr. August's talk, and it has come up a little bit in some of the comments here, and maybe it's a good last question for me to have for the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience, is this idea that with these illnesses, people are going to be in different phases at different times, and there's going to be that initial first episode, which is incredibly terrifying for everyone involved. And so maybe I would love to hear some comments about like what is most important for the family in that first episode. And and I'll add the piece to it. I'm someone who's very interested and feels it's very important to do research with people in the first episode, because that's when we're going to find interventions that might actually change the course, right? But there's, as Dr. August alluded to, there's many complex issues because of where the family's at, where the patient is at. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your thoughts on, what, for example, in that first episode of illness, what do you need as family members, and what should we be mindful of as researchers, and yet how can we still support some research happening in that time period?
For me, and I'm ahead of the first episode program. I was one of the parents who went over to Dr. Schultz when he was head of the department and complained about how, the lack of things. And so I'm glad to hear I know about the first episode program, and I've been to one of their meetings that Michelle invited me to. And so that's such a huge improvement, because that wasn't there for our son, who's 39 and was diagnosed when he was 21. But I think I would underscore what others said, the value of other parents, because doctors and social workers or nobody has enough time to talk to a first episode parent. It has to be other parents who, take the time. And so I think that is actually the best thing you can do is, refer people on to talk to others. And I think that the first episode also is the most fruitful time to have to participate in research, or shortly thereafter, because our son now is, on a fragile, he's tried every drug, and he's finally on Haldol because nothing else really works for him for an antipsychotic. So I would never advise, and I don't think he would want to be in research, because he's been through all the second generation meds, and because of going on and off of them so much, they don't work anymore. So the first episode people, he actually volunteered. Our whole family was part of research at the VA hospital. It wasn't a drug study, but our daughter came back from Washington, D.C., and my husband and I took time off of work, and Jim was in it, and we enjoyed it because we thought we were helping. But the drug study, he volunteered for one at the National Institute of Mental Health, and he was actually turned down due to something in his record that he had some issue with a recent suicide, so they said he couldn't be in it. But he wanted to. So I think those early people are, the best recruits, and they haven't tried all the meds, so they maybe are willing to try a bunch of them to help out at the same time.
Other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, my son Nick is a very enthusiastic participant in the research. I think he's very socially conscious minded, and so he sees his role as helping, paying it forward, because he wouldn't have had the treatment options and the success that he's had were it not for the early research. But also the money helps. Let's put it out there.
Yeah. Other thoughts, Mike?
Actually, when you first presented that question, I thought about it quite a bit, and I wrote this down. I kind of called it a flurry of emotions for the family, and it's entirely normal for anybody, for any of those families, to experience a flurry of emotions when that loved one is diagnosed with a serious mental illness. Guilt, shame, disbelief, fear, anger, they're all common reactions, and if you think you're not going to experience that, you're out of touch with reality, because you should and would. Acceptance takes time, both for the diagnosed patient and especially for the family members or their friends. And that acceptance happens at a different pace for everyone, and you have to keep telling yourself to be patient. Be patient with yourself, and be patient with that ill person or ill friend or ill family member. But I think one of the most important things you can do, to support a family member is to, like I mentioned earlier, educate yourself. The more you learn about what to expect, the easier it is for you to provide the right kind of support. And that's only from a lot of years of trying to think what's the right way to do it and finding out that was probably the wrong way, but you only learn by experience. And something Mindy said before is, I wrote this down, I smiled. One of the most important things you can do to support a loved one with mental illness is to have hope. Yeah. And I think that is so critical, that just don't ever lose hope.
Yeah, great. I think that's a wonderful segue into inviting the audience to see if there's any questions that people would like to ask of our panelists. And we've got, I think, Leslie and Dan. I've got the light in my eyes, I can't see up here, so. Oh.
I work with a number of people who are chronic and persistently mentally ill, and many of their families have just absolutely bowed out. They have nothing to do with the client, and I'm just wondering if you have any comments or suggestions of what clinicians can do, because the families just will not, have refused to have any contact.
Well, I was saying something to, I think it was Grace or Michelle beforehand, when Dr. August was talking about families being intimidated by the mental health system and the doctors and the trials and all of that. I said, we are the survivors, so we're probably not the right ones up here to have succumbed to that. But I see that too, and I suffer from that, even though I am involved, because I have an older son, and everywhere, he's 39, and everywhere I go now, they assume that none of the other families want to be involved. So they don't have family programs, even with the MA benefit set not including family involvement, they also just plain assume if they did have anything that no one would come. And I maintain, and I always say when I go, and there's 2 or 3 others of us there, that this is learned behavior. We learned not to come because of how we were treated.
Yeah, yeah.
I would add to that. Again, we've talked about first episode, and our son was just so sick, so psychotic for 2 years. And we are blessed with resources and a huge extended family and friends who really supported us. It was hell those first 2 years. So when I see families, and I'm aware of those who are done, perhaps they don't have the resources, perhaps they have those experiences as Mindy talked about, but I understand it, and I've said many times, were it not for us, and we feel blessed, our son would be one of those on the street. And that's what happens when families step away. What is it now? 40% of the homeless are actually people with mental illness. And so I would not give up on them. And again, how providers respond and help them to access resources that might be in their life is super important. I mean, we needed respite care, and we had big full-time jobs. My husband and I, both of us, our careers were sort of peaking, and we had families that, I have 7 sisters, so that helped a lot. There's a lot of aunties who came and said, we'll stay with them, and they loved their nephew, and they stayed with them for the weekend so we could get away. Were it not for that, I think you just get so burned out, maybe we're all a little more stubborn and resourceful than others, but I feel very empathic because it's extremely hard on families.
And I think, too, I have to say that my daughter actually was not diagnosed with bipolar until her second semester of college. But prior to that, it was just the depression and everything. But the writing was on the wall that eventually that diagnosis was going to come. And by that point, my son in 2005, through the U of M, was already diagnosed with on the autism spectrum. So I was already burnt out with going with her. And so I did throw my hands up. I, ended up taking her to a shelter because I didn't have anybody else. We're all we have, the 3 of us in Minnesota. And I work with, in corrections, and so I know about mental health, and I know there's different resources that were out there. But now I have to rely on them. And, I knew about armed services, but really, I didn't want to give up on my daughter, and I felt like relying on those resources was me giving up on my daughter, but it's been a blessing. She has in-home services, she has a therapist. All those services are working. Yes, she has manic episodes, but we get through them, and I'm not as burnt out because I got to be there now for my son, who's a young adult. So I've been there. So just, again, like I said earlier, asking that parent, that caregiver, how are you doing? Are you taking care of yourself? Do you need to talk to a social worker? Because I needed that push to get those other resources because I was carrying the weight on my shoulders, and it was, my getaway was getting a second job and working overnights. Having 1 day a week off was my getaway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you say that you're a medical health care, or you're a healthcare provider? Right. I might be a little optimistic. I'd be interested to see what you say here, but isn't it possible that, maybe with your exception here, that there are other people who could get into the picture if what you're saying is that you end up dealing with the patient or the person with the illness independently, alone all the time. I'm just wondering, I got to give a shout out to NAMI because they have such great programs, educational programs, and it seems to me that there's always somebody who knows what's going on. It might be that we have to rely on social media. It might be that we have to take more unconventional steps to try to find out where that social network is, that personal network for that individual, or
That it might not always be the nuclear family. Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a good question here.
So just to piggyback kind of on the providers and maybe the researchers, I think it's important to let the family members know that you can empathize with where they're at, meeting them where they're at. that empathy can go a long way because they may be more open to receiving resources. They may be more open to listening or persistence. I know that sometimes that can take, more than one try, but often it's just letting the family members know hope, empathy, and resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Any questions? Yes? I think we'll take 2 more questions. I see we've got 2, and then I do want to make sure we have time to mingle in the reception. So these will be our last 2 questions.
One thing.
Yes, one here and one here. Yes.
Do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, go
One
ahead.
thing, there seems to be an emphasis on first response, and I'm a community member with a mentally ill son, older, like 36, with first episode, and a professional, 10-year professional with a PhD. We had just a very, very difficult time in terms of getting any attention, in terms of getting any help. It was probably 18 months with 10 or so hospitalizations, and because of his level of functioning, we couldn't get anywhere. And I don't know if anyone can address that or what may be going on in those kinds of situations.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where the family members' input is essential. My son learned to compensate for his limitations. His dyslexia, he couldn't read, his social, all those pieces. He's learned to compensate. You look at him, there's nothing wrong with him. Very social. And how that perception can be misperceived. Like, there's nothing wrong. Why are you here? What's going on? And it's that squeaky wheel. It's about, look, this is what he's experiencing. We may not be in crisis right now, but we just were a couple hours ago. We just were a few days ago. And this is what's going on. And I need you to listen to me. I need you to let me know, to hear what's been happening and what my son or whoever may be experiencing. That's where that input is so essential.
Mm-hmm. And I can just say as a side note that certainly improving access to mental health services is something that I know it's actually it's becoming sort of a national issue, but certainly here locally at the university, it's something that this department is very focused on and dedicated to in the coming years. We had one more question here. Yes.
I was just going to make a comment. You talked about labeling and stigmatization. I work in the field of obesity research, and we stopped using the language we always used, which was the obese patient. Instead, we use patient-first language. We say the patient with obesity or the patient with diabetes. Mm-hmm. I would encourage the use of patient-first language in this area as well, for the professionals and the patients.
Yep. Yep.
That was my very first piece of legislation, was making the reviser go through every statute in the state and do that.
Yeah, great. Well, that I think is a perfect note to end this very wonderful symposium and very special afternoon. Thank you all for joining, for your attention. Thank you to Dr. August for a phenomenal talk. Thank you to the panelists for sharing so much. And please come and mingle with us.